Well, this time we want to prepare ourselves for our history bit today. And today's history bit is going to be focusing on the concept of canonization. The concept of canonization. And I'm going to be sharing this from the booklet that I wrote, as I have been sharing a number of things from this booklet. And the booklet that I wrote is called the so-called Apocrypha or Set Apart Writings. And so what I want to do, I want to read something in here that's going to give us an understanding of how the books of Scripture were selected. And the basis for sharing this is to help us to understand why certain books are in the compilation of the Scriptures and why certain books are not. But with that being said, we need to be mindful that many of these leaders during that particular time in history did not always have the same perspective on certain books as others. Because you all know, or if you didn't know, the book that we teach out of, called Revelation, at one point in earlier centuries was not received as one of the books to be canonized. And so what we need to do as we understand some of the principles and guidelines about canonization, we need to understand, most of all, what was the method that our Messiah used and his apostles used, and what books did they receive as being regarded as sacred scripture. And that is by far the most important thing that we need to be mindful of. All right. And so in the reading, I'm reading from page 29 under Concepts of Canonization. And I'm going to read also another section in the book, which is going to deal with apparent guidelines for accepting books of Scripture by the Messiah and the apostles. Let's listen to the reading. The term canon comes from the Greek word kanon, meaning rule or measuring stick. It was first used by the Christian church to refer to the scriptures that were considered authoritative. The concepts and rules of canonization are varied, depending on the importance of certain books to a particular religious system's tradition and beliefs. The historical records indicate that the finalization of the Hebrew scriptures being canonized occurred around 200 CE, and the Septuagint and writings of the apostles were canonized in the 4th century CE. However, there was not complete agreement regarding the acceptance of the books. Now let me pause. Now, based upon what has been recorded, what has been noted in history, the Hebrew scriptures, being that set of scriptures from Bereshit to the writings that we commonly have now, or that have been called the Apocrypha, that set was regarded as being canonized in 200 CE, and the Septuagint and the writings of the apostles in the 4th century. However, there was not complete agreement regarding the acceptance of the books. Some religious traditions included different books in their canon. Among the Christian religious traditions, for example, the Western Catholic Church has 73 books. The Eastern Orthodox churches have 79 books. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church has 81 books. And the Protestant denominations range from 66 to 80 books. Prior to the 4th century, the history of these differences stemmed from each city church having its own canon of scripture. Let me pause and just kind of explain this. In the early, very early centuries of the Messianic communities, when you get into the 2nd century, each particular regional congregation had its own set of books. At that particular time, all of the books that we have compiled in the canon of scripture, or what is called the canon of scripture today, was not compiled and put together. So you had each city congregation, each city church had their books. Some of them had a certain number, others had a certain number. And so there was no continuity with regard to all of the books being accepted. Because see, the thing is that during the 2nd century of the Messianic Israelite community, you had congregations that had not yet received the writings of some of the apostles. Because the apostles that were writing, they were writing to specific congregations. Like when we read in the scriptures, Paul wrote to the Ephesians. That letter was a letter that the congregation in Ephesus had. Or he wrote to the congregation in Corinth. Or he wrote to the region of Galatia. So the peoples in those regions had those letters. But the peoples that lived in other regions did not know anything about what Paul had said or written to these people. Does this make sense? Yeah. So during the early centuries, each city congregation had its own set of books. Now, all of them had the Hebrew scriptures because the Torah and the prophets and the writings were foundational. But the writings of the apostles, they were still circulating, you see. And so this particular text where it says prior to the 4th century, the history of these differences stemmed from each city church having its own canon of scriptures. There was no such thing as a universal Bible during that time. While attempts were made to obtain a universal Bible, it says, through the Council of Laodicea, the various Christian religious traditions did not universally accept the same number of books as inspired scripture. So there's always been a difference between whether this particular religious tradition accepted all of the same books as the other religious tradition accepted. And during that time, you had primarily the Western churches and the Eastern churches, which over time came to commonly be called the Orthodox churches of the East and the Western Roman Catholic churches of the West. This was before Protestantism ever came on the scene. But here's some of the rules for canonization. The rules for canonizing the writings of the apostles. Number one, the book had to be of apostolic origin, attributed to the teaching and preaching of the first generation apostles or their closest companions. Number two, second rule, universal acceptance of the book. In other words, if everybody had a copy of it and everybody was using it, there was consensus that, okay, we all agree, you got one, I got one, this church has one, that congregation has one, we'll accept that book. Also, liturgical use, the books that were being used in the worship services. And also, a consistent message. Now, consistent message, this rule was probably by far the one that was very weighty, because It had to do with the fact that the message of the book had to be consistent with the writings of the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, I want to read some apparent guidelines for accepting the Scriptures by Messiah and the apostles. One might ask, well, since the canon of Scripture didn't occur until all the way into the 4th century, then how did the Messiah, how did the apostles come to terms about which writings would be accepted or not? Or were there any rules that they used? And so let me read. We have discussed the perspectives on canonization of the Scriptures that were developed by religious traditions after the 2nd century CE. Now it is important to examine the perspective of Messiah and the apostles regarding the guidelines for accepting the books of Scripture. It is evident that the Messiah and the apostles received the so-called apocryphal books as contained in the Septuagint and the Hebrew manuscripts that the Septuagint was translated from. These books were part of the collection of scriptures that were in common use throughout the Judean Israelite community of their time. The Messiah's and the apostles' references to the so-called apocryphal books by the numerous quotations and allusions bears witness to the fact of their acceptance of these books as being set apart scripture. While there was no specific guidelines for canonization like those developed for the writings of the apostles in the 3rd and 4th century CE, it is obvious that the basis for receiving such books were because of their agreement with the Torah and the prophets. There are 2 verses of scripture that can be used for measuring all prophecy in written scripture. And I want us to hear this. These are 2 of the most important verses that are used as a means of basically saying, whatever writing is written after the Torah, what Moses wrote, and the books of the prophets, we measure them or we validate them based upon their agreement with what has already been written. Listen to this verse here. Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your law, your Torah, is truth. Psalm 119, verse 142. This verse basically establishes the fact that the Torah is regarded as the truth. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 20. To the law, or the Torah, and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. This particular verse, what it does, it shows us that all writings, all prophecy that is given must speak according to the Torah and the testimony. If it does not, then it is because there is no light in those writings or those so-called prophetic words spoken. The so-called apocryphal books were part of the scriptures of Yeshua's day. Also, they were received by Yeshua and his apostles because they met the criteria of the above verses. Along with this, there is no historical evidence of the Messianic Israelite community or the sect of the Nazarenes of the 1st and 2nd century debating or questioning the validity of the sacredness of the so-called apocryphal books. As previously noted, the Apostolic Canons, canon number 55 and 56, gave a list of the books of Scripture, which included the so-called Apocrypha as part of the Old Testament. Canon number 55 confirmed that the 2nd century Messianic Israelite community had received these books as sacred. Listen again to a portion of Canon 55 of the Apostolic Canons. And after I read this portion, we will close with this. It says in the Apostolic Canons, these were writings that were written, giving instruction about what the apostles have already accepted and the rules for how the congregations were to function. It says, concerning which books of the Old and New Testaments are received in the Christian church, and these books shall all be sacred and honored to the clergy and laity. This statement was made right before a listing of the books of Scripture were given that the apostles had regarded as being sacred Scripture. And in that listing that was given, there was the inclusion of these books that have been commonly called the Apocryphal books. So what we're saying today is that Messiah and the apostles did not just accept the Hebrew Scriptures and the writings of the apostles, but they also accepted those books that have been commonly called the Apocrypha. And so I trust that this information has been helpful and enlightening to you, to help you to be able to understand what rules were used in picking and choosing the books of Scripture that we have, and also to help us to understand that the religious traditions that many of us may have come out from may not always have used the best guidance in making their choices, because for those of us who have been a part of the Protestant traditions, who have a Bible that has only 66 books, many of us are unaware of the fact that the Messiah and the apostles, their Bibles had more books than the ones that many of us use. And so what that means is that those who may have come out of those traditions may need to take another look and consider that the books that have been deemed non-canonical may need to be looked at again. And so the Most High be praised today.